All right, everyone. Welcome to Theories of Emotion and Expressing Emotion. So, what is an emotion? An emotion is basically a full on mind body behavior experience to some sort of stimuli or situation. And I'm sure that this resonates with you based on your own circumstances in life, particularly times when you felt like your emotions might have been a little bit out of control. So, how do we experience emotions? First of all, we experience physiological arousal due to, again, some stimulus or situation around us. Typically, the physiological arousal we feel in any particular emotion is really similar. You tend to get a little bit sweaty, your heart rate tends to increase. It's basically like a little fight or flight response that you go into, regardless of whether you're experiencing positive or negative emotion. Sometimes, particularly when we are experiencing negative emotion, we tend to also then do various behaviors. So, if I'm furious at someone, then I'm probably going to engage in behaviors like yelling, clenching my fists, perhaps using sarcasm or a rude tone of voice inflection. And then we also eventually, hopefully, if we're emotionally aware people, label our feelings. We can say, goodness gracious, based on how I am feeling inside and what's going on around me, I feel happy, sad, panic, fear, joy, etc. We're going to look at four major theories of emotion. And theories of emotion generally address two major questions. Number one, does our physiological arousal come before, after, or at the same time as the emotional feelings we experience? The second major question is, how does our thinking and how do our feelings then interact with one another? So let's take a look at these major theories. The first theory we're going to look at is the James Lang theory of emotion. And you have a space in your notebook to go ahead and take a peek at his theory by clicking on the link there and then filling in those spaces below. Provide a brief explanation. Share with me your own example of how this theory might work in action in your life. And then, as well, the impact and the criticisms of this particular theory. Okay, so the James Lang theory of emotion states that emotion is our conscious awareness of our physiological responses to stimuli. Our body arousal happens first, according to James Lang, and then the cognitive awareness and label for the feeling come in. So, according to this theory, if something physiologically makes us smile, we might then label that as happy or feel happy. So here's an applied example. Pretend you're walking down the street late at night and you see this special friend coming out of the shadows and he's like, "Hey, what's your hurry?" James Lang says, step one, there's a creepy guy. Step two, according to James Lang, you have a physiological response. You go into the fight or flight response. And eventually, once your brain registers those physiological changes, you feel fear. Okay. So that's James Lang. Cannon-Bard has the same elements as James Lang, but Cannon and Bard believe that those elements happen in a different sequence. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Again, you can go ahead and pause the video, take a peek at the Cannon-Bard theory in more detail yourself, fill out those spaces below, and then let's look again in more detail at the Cannon-Bard theory. So the Cannon-Bard theory asserts that we have a conscious or cognitive experience of an emotion at the same exact time as our body is responding, not afterward, like James and Lang say. So Cannon and Bard say the human body responses run parallel to the cognitive responses rather than causing them. So again, going back to our example, we see a creepy guy and at the same time, then, according to Cannon and Bard, we have that fight or flight response, and our brain labels, I am scared, I am afraid, and trembling at the same time. Okay. A really common pitfall is for students to confuse these theories together because they're not overly exciting and they're named after these dudes that created them. So, one hint to help you keep these straight that works for me is I think about the fact that Canon and Bard, C and B, are very close together in the alphabet. And they say that these two elements happen simultaneously. Whereas James and Lang, J is a little bit farther away from L in the alphabet. And they say that the physiological arousal happens before the cognitive arousal. So maybe that'll help you, hopefully so. Then we have a third theory of emotion, Schachter and Singer's two-factor theory of emotion. In the exam, they'll either refer to it as Schachter and Singer's theory or the two-factor theory. So you want to know that those are synonymous terms. I'll always put them together for you. Go ahead and take a look at that particular article. These guys basically say the two-factor theory suggests that emotions don't exist until we mentally in our brain add a label to whatever body sensations we're feeling. So according to them, arousal plus label equals emotion. So I face a stranger and my heart is pounding. Before I label that, I have to cognitively, consciously think, am I feeling afraid? Am I excited? Am I mad? Did I just have too much caffeine today? And then eventually I'm going to label it and act accordingly. Okay, so this theory is really different from the other ones because they're talking about the fact that our mind has some degree of control over the behavior, or I'm sorry, the emotion that we end up labeling and then subsequent behavior. So according to these guys, there's a stimulus, then there's physiological arousal. I am trembling. Number three, then there's cognitive appraisal. I'm thinking about, gosh, my body's trembling. This creepy guy's here. What am I feeling? I am feeling fear. And then number four, then is that conscious labeling of emotion and acting accordingly. Okay, so I know that these theories, you guys, can seem really similar to each other. I wanted to put a summary chart here so that you can see the difference. But basically, everything starts with being presented by a stimulus. James Lang says, first, I have a physical response, then my mind automatically labels the emotion. Cannon and Bard say those two things happen at the same time. Schachter and Singer say, while you are physiologically having a response, you consciously take a moment to think for yourself. It doesn't automatically happen. They say you think based on what's going on in your surroundings, and then you label the emotion, and then eventually that's felt and you act, okay? Go ahead and take a pause in the video and check out these other common theories of emotion. Those were the big three, and we're just going to look at one other together that kind of combines the work of some of the guys that you see here. Okay, so thinking and emotion. The big idea is that thinking does not always, under every circumstance, precede emotion, according to the fellows that you see on the screen there. They are famous for showing that some emotional reactions, especially fears, immediate likes and dislikes, actually develop in what they call a low road through the brain, skipping conscious thought. So Schachter and Singer say, no, every time we feel an emotion, we have consciously labeled that emotion and that causes us to act. And these guys are like, no, that is not true. Sometimes the text that you see in the blue there, that could be true. Information might be sent to the cortex for analysis and then transmitted to the amygdala. However, they say some super negative things and basic likes and dislikes are actually just sent directly to the amygdala via the thalamus, and that produces an instant reaction. So hopefully that knowledge will help you feel better about the times in your life, you guys, when you've kind of lost it emotionally. If you've ever immediately responded in an overly negative way, or you've made a face of disgust and offended somebody, like if you didn't like their food or other stuff like that, your body's just kind of working against your brain in those situations. The lower animal part of your brain is processing those types of situations as opposed to your uniquely human cerebral cortex. Okay, one more time, here is another summary chart for you that includes Lazarus's cognitive mediational theory, which is what we just looked at. And hopefully those two comparisons will help you as you continue to make sense of these. Okay. Go ahead and pause again. Check out Paul Ekman's research. This is fascinating. And he basically looks at which sorts of emotions are universally experienced and shown on our faces, via which are culture dependent. Super interesting stuff. Okay, so let's talk about culture and emotional expression. Research shows us that there are some universally understood facial expressions, meaning that regardless of the culture that you grow up in, if people say, "Show me a happy face," they'll smile like the lady in the top left. If you say, "Show me a surprise face," they will look like the lady in the top right, and so on and so forth. Maybe you can take a minute to guess the emotions that the people in the pictures are feeling. But they've done really cool research to show that there's basic emotions that are hardwired into our bodies such that we make the same exact faces for them, regardless of the culture that we've grown up in. So this biological influence over our emotions as compared to like the nurture approach. Super fascinating. And so let's talk about some other examples of what might elicit emotion in us. Let's talk about facial feedback. So, the effect of facial expressions on our experienced emotions, like when a facial expression of anger or happiness is around us, can actually intensify our own feelings of anger or happiness. They've done research that shows that, let's say that I'm angry with somebody and I go up to them and I start something with them. Once they make an angry expression back at me, that literally serves to physiologically heighten the emotion that I'm feeling. And the good news is it can work for positive emotions as well, but they've done some really cool research to show that just the state of other people's faces as we're walking by can actually have an impact on our own emotions. Okay, embodied emotion. So again, people aren't always attuned to what's happening inside their physiological body when they're experiencing emotions. But basically, lots of research has shown that when you're emotionally aroused, you're basically in the fight or flight response. So I wanted to put this summary chart here for you again. We saw this in the biopsych chapter, just so you can take a look at that. And then when we're calming down from an emotional reaction, then our parasympathetic division kicks in. So just want to remember, throw that reminder out to you that when we're getting emotionally aroused, our sympathetic nervous system is sending us into that fight or flight response a little bit. And when we're calming down, our parasympathetic nervous system is kicking in. We talked about the Yerkes-Dodson law already, and this says that our performance peaks at lower levels of arousal, including emotional arousal for difficult tasks, and higher levels of arousal, including emotional arousal for easy or well-learned tasks. So just wanted to take a moment to throw that in there to let you know that physiological arousal and emotional arousal are similar and they act the same according to this particular theory. Let's look at the physiology of emotions. What causes these for us? So, different emotions do not have distinct biological signatures and they don't engage really distinct regions of the brain. So, you're looking at the regions of the brain that are activated when we experience pretty much any emotion. So, the insula is activated when we experience different social emotions like lust or pride or disgust. Let's look at the amygdala. So compared with those watching angry faces, those watching fearful faces show way more activity in their amygdala than other folks, which makes sense because we know from the silly video that I showed you earlier this year, that Wigdala guy, that amygdala is linked with fear. Prefrontal cortex, when experiencing negative emotions like disgust, the right prefrontal cortex is more active than the left, which is interesting. And frontal lobe, depression-prone people and those with generally negative personalities in general, like glass half empty type of people, they tend to show more right frontal lobe activity. So these are just some examples of really cool brain research they've done, trying to link brain activity to the expressed emotions of people out in the world. And normally they do that using PET scans, where they'll put people into a particular emotional state and then they'll look at their brain activity. Or if somebody's already experiencing intense emotions like depression, they'll look at their brain via a PET scan to see what's going on in there, or an fMRI. All right. Fear and joy affect our heart similarly, but they stimulate different facial muscles, obviously. So fear causes brow muscles to tense, while joy causes eye and cheek muscles to pull into a smile. And again, this is at a physiological level, which I think is really cool. They've done studies that show that even blind people who have never seen another human face before, their faces make the exact same emotions for those primary emotions like happy, sad, afraid, surprised, as everybody else, even though they've never seen that modeled. So kind of fascinating. Emotions and physiological responses. So physiological arousal, like I mentioned earlier, is much the same from one emotion to another. Just wanted to re-emphasize that here. And because of that, polygraph tests have become sort of popular. They measure emotion-linked changes in breathing, heart activity, and perspiration. And the argument against the effectiveness of them. So physiological arousal is, again, really similar from one emotion to another, but a lot of innocent people respond with a heightened physiological response because they're just nervous in the particular lie detector situation. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lying when they get physiological aroused. They're just experiencing some sort of emotion, and it's really difficult to tell that apart because you always have the same physiological response regardless of what emotion is happening. Okay, so polygraphs are not accurate enough to justify widespread use in business and law enforcement. They used to try to do that and they're not allowed to anymore. The use of guilty knowledge questions and new forms of technology might produce better indications of lying. So we'll talk about that next time. Last little thing here, detecting emotion in other people. So obviously, most of us develop the ability over time to be able to label and work with our own emotions. Another big part of emotional intelligence is figuring out how other people feel and responding accordingly. What are some ways that we do that? We basically look at their behavior and try to figure out what they are thinking and feeling. And so there are just a couple examples for you of how nonverbal behavior, far more than what people are actually saying, help us understand what people are feeling in any given situation so that we can figure out a decent response. Another example of how facial expressions can even help us understand how other people are feeling. A Duchenne smile, this guy Duchenne did this research, and so it's called the Duchenne smile. It activates the muscles underneath the eyes and raises up the cheeks, and that's what actually indicates a real smile. You might have seen some people that are doing a fake smile, and the best way that you can tell is that they don't get those eye wrinkles when they're smiling. I remember one time I was doing behavioral therapy with this little girl not too long ago, and she's like, "You have such wrinkly eyes." And I'm like, "You know what? I am going to take that as a compliment because that means that I have real smiled a whole bunch of times in my life." And I definitely was real smiling with her. So, people realize those lines around the eyes are how you can tell if somebody's genuine with you in terms of smiling. Okay, we're going to talk about some culture and emotional expression next time in class. But just as a reminder here or informing you, gestures, facial expressions can absolutely help us understand how people around us are feeling, but they're different depending on the culture that we're a part of. So we'll talk about some other examples next time in class. Music, happy and sad music tends to feel happy and sad around the world. Fast-paced music usually seems happier to people regardless of culture, while slower tempo music seems to be a little bit more sad. And that's what we got for this time. We'll see you in class next time. Thanks so much.